18-year-old Gabriela Escucha was a driven single mom.
She was 17 when she got pregnant. She did not let that stop her. She was a very strong person.
She was going to school, working.
And while she wasn't looking for love, she did make room in her busy life for 18-year-old Javier Barrios.
She thought he was kind of cute. In her mind, just hanging out, having fun.
But their romance would be short-lived, and so would Javier.
The bullet went through his heart.
This was a big case, big press case.
This happened in broad daylight at a busy intersection.
Was it simply a coincidence?
Her taste in men seemed questionable.
He did have prior incidents of violence.
Or did a bad breakup end in murder?
She was a cold-blooded, manipulative killer.
Plainfield, Illinois, October 28, 2007. It was after 4 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon in this sprawling Chicago suburb, 45 minutes from the Loop.
It's a very typical American suburb. There's a lot of farm history, but a lot of retail development, a lot of housing has sprung up there lately.
And even though it was Sunday, the intersection of Route 59 and 135th Street was jammed with cars.
Route 59 in Plainfield is one of the busiest streets in Will County, and Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock was as busy as it can be.
However, that Sunday afternoon was anything but typical, because at around 4:40 p.m., motorists waiting for the light to change were startled by a sound coming from the abandoned gas station beside the road.
Witnesses heard gunshots, saw a man chasing another man.
That alone was enough to shock the motorists sitting at the red light.
Everyone from Plainfield would think they're removed enough from the violence of the inner city.
But they were wrong. As the witnesses looked on in horror, the fleeing man collapsed to the ground, and the gunman walked up to where he lay
and shot him in the back of the head.
By all accounts, it appeared to be execution.
And then, after shooting his victim twice in the head at point-blank range, the shooter strolled over to a black sedan parked at the gas station, got into the passenger seat, and casually made his getaway.
What stood out was how calmly the car pulled away.
They did not speed.
However, even as the shooter drove away, police were already en route to the scene, summoned by numerous witnesses horrified by what they had just seen.
People don't get shot in Plainfield. People don't get murdered in Plainfield.
But whether Plainfield liked it or not, gangs and violence had come to town. And caught in the middle was a local teenager, 18-year-old Gabriela Escucha. Born in 1989, Gabriela Escucha wasn't originally from Plainfield. Like a lot of people in the booming suburb, she had Chicago roots.
The family had moved from the Chicago area to Plainfield, to the suburbs.
They'd come for more or less the same reasons everyone else did, in search of a quiet, safe place to raise a family.
It's a nice suburban community.
And Gabriela was a typical suburban kid.
Gabriela had a good upbringing. She grew up in a middle-class neighborhood, part of a middle-class family.
She was really bright. She did well in school. She was very athletic.
She was in basketball and volleyball. She represented her school in a speech competition, and she won second place.
And she dreamed of someday going to college.
She wanted to become a forensics anthropologist.
It appeared that Gabriela had everything going for her.
But in 2006, during her senior year of high school, Gabriela got a little off track when she became pregnant.
She was 17 when she got pregnant. She did not let that stop her. She graduated.
The baby's father didn't stick around, though.
He decided not to be in the picture at all. He actually wanted her to have an abortion, but she didn't want that for her daughter, so she made the choice of becoming a single mother.
Didn't really matter that her baby's father didn't want to be involved. She knew she had the support of all of us.
Once the baby was born in December of 2006, Gabriella was, by all accounts, a devoted mother.
She was a good mother, very attentive to her child.
And with help from her family, Gabriella got a part-time job at the local mall after the baby was born and enrolled in community college.
When she was going to school, working, her mother, the grandmother, took care of the child, and so that her parents very much supported her.
But they wouldn't have to support her for long, not if Gabriella had anything to say about it.
She was a very strong person.
This was a young woman who was really on a mission to make a better life for herself, to make a better life for her child.
However, there was still one thing standing in her way. The same thing that had left her with a child in the first place.
Her taste in men seemed questionable.
And even after becoming a mother, she dated a series of troubled young men.
She did seem to be gravitating towards unsavory characters.
Despite her family's disapproval.
I believe that she could do better. She was doing great with her life.
After all, the single mom was in school and she had a job, which, as it turned out, was how she happened to meet 18-year-old Javier Barrios. It was June of 2007 when Javier happened to be shopping at the cell phone kiosk in the mall where Gabriella worked.
He was, I think, 5'3", 107 pounds, so certainly not physically imposing in any way.
But that didn't appear to matter to Gabriella.
She thought he was kind of cute.
And it wasn't long before Gabriella managed to get his attention, too.
He was wearing a particular pair of shoes. She had commented something about, hey, those are sharp shoes.
They talked for a few minutes.
She thought that he was engaging.
And when Javier asked Gabriella for her number, she gave it to him.
He ended up calling her, and she agreed to go out.
She liked him for a summer romance.
More as someone to hang out with, rather than anything too serious.
She agreed to go out with Javier. In her mind, really more as friends.
Although after a few dates, she did discover that the cute boy with the sharp shoes was exactly her type. In all the wrong ways.
Her taste in men seemed to be her downfall.
He did have prior instances of violence.
He was 18, I believe, very young, somewhat impulsive.
Impulsive enough that by the time he was 18, he'd already racked up a juvenile record.
He didn't have any lengthy criminal history.
There were minor incidents, mostly.
There was an episode where he and I think his brother had gotten into a violent fight with some other people.
But they were enough to get him transferred to an alternative school.
He was kicked out of the regular school. So, I mean, that's a red flag on him right there.
However, despite the red flags, Javier appeared to be a perfect gentleman.
He was very nice, very attentive, would bring her lunch while she was at work, things like that.
So for much of that June and July, Gabriella and Javier went out, casually.
They were kicking it. That's where you're in a dating relationship, but there's no expectation of sex.
At least there was no expectation on Gabriella's part. But what about Javier?
There was a sense that Javier Barrios may have been more into the relationship than Gabby was.
Although after a few weeks of dating, it appeared that she had come around to Javier's way of thinking. At least that's what their families both thought.
His family and her family both thought they were boyfriend and girlfriend.
His family babysat for her while they went out, and they were accustomed to having her around their home.
In fact, by the end of the summer, it looked as if Gabriela and Javier were well past the point of just kicking it.
They appeared to be an exclusive boyfriend-girlfriend that summer.
But that fall, a fatal encounter in a Plainfield parking lot would leave the police wondering, was their relationship as exclusive as it appeared? At a little before 5 o'clock on October 28, 2007, the police in Plainfield, Illinois, were flooded with multiple 911 calls about a shooting at the corner of Route 59 and 135th Street.
And this happened in broad daylight at a gas station at a busy intersection.
And while the police arrived within minutes, they were too late to help the victim.
By the time cops got to the scene, it was clearly already deceased.
The victim was a young male, identified as 18-year-old Javier Barrios.
One of the cops that shows up on the crime scene happened to be the school police liaison for the special school where Mr. Barrios had attended and knew Javier Barrios.
He'd been shot a total of 3 times.
1 to the body and 2 to the back of the head.
According to the passing motorists, most had heard the first shot and seen Javier run and collapse. And then the killer had calmly finished him off.
He just walked over and shot him without saying anything.
It was a hit. It was execution style.
Then, after executing Javier, the killer and his getaway driver had just as calmly fled the scene in a black sedan.
After the shooting, they pull out of the parking lot, stop at a stoplight, and then drive away.
But who was the killer who seemed so nonchalant about committing a murder in broad daylight? Despite the numerous witnesses who'd seen the car leaving the scene, the investigators had only a general description, but no immediate leads, not even a license plate. However, when the investigators did a quick record search on Javier, a promising lead immediately surfaced.
When cops ran Barrios' name, they found that a restraining order had been filed against him.
And the person who'd taken out the order was Javier's girlfriend, Gabriela Escucha. The order of protection was dated October 11th, roughly 2.5 weeks prior to the shooting.
Gabriela had accused Barrios of threatening her and her family.
There were definitely physical intimidation.
According to the order, the threats and intimidation began in September, when she'd ended their 3-month romance.
Gabriela said that she had tried to move their relationship into a friendship.
She's actively trying to pull away from Barrios.
However, the order of protection claimed that the more Gabriela tried to pull away, the more aggressive Javier became.
It ultimately escalated to an incident where he came to her house.
According to the report, Javier had shown up at her house on September 27th and started screaming at her from the street.
Barrios continues with the verbal assaults, with the threats.
And when Gabriela refused to let him in, the order of protection claimed that Javier had taken his anger out on Gabriela's car.
He's shooting out windows, he's shooting out headlights.
It was only a BB gun, but still.
This was in broad daylight.
And then when Gabriela had rushed out to stop him from shooting up the car, the order of protection claimed that Javier had turned on her.
He had shot her with a BB gun.
The report said that Javier had physically assaulted her, too.
He slaps her in the face and grabs her throat with both hands and squeezes until she's afraid that she's not going to be able to breathe.
And it appeared that the allegations in the order of protection might have been true. When the investigators dug further, they discovered that Gabriela had reported the incident.
She had gone to the police.
But nothing had come of it.
They treated it just like, well, this is a lover's quarrel, and they said, do you want to press charges? And I think she was afraid at the time, and so police didn't act.
However, Javier's threats had apparently continued, so Gabriela had gone to the authorities again and taken out the order of protection.
She'd done what the police said, got an order of protection. She thought that was going to keep her safe.
But now that Javier was dead, the police couldn't help but wonder. Had Gabriela decided to take matters into her own hands? There was nothing in her history that seemed to suggest she would do such a thing.
Gabriela seemed to be doing everything she was supposed to be doing. She was a single mother, working, going to school.
She had no prior criminal history. She didn't seem like the hard, streetwise type that you would normally expect to wind up in a situation like this.
It appeared that Gabriela had everything going for her, but her taste in men.
However, for the moment, she was the investigators' only lead.
Gabriela was immediately on the short list of people police wanted to speak with.
But that Sunday evening, when the investigators went to the address that Gabriela had listed on the order of protection,
she was nowhere to be found.
Did that mean she was on the run? Or was there an entirely innocent explanation? The investigators had no idea, and unable to talk to Gabriela, they tried a different approach.
They're subpoenaing phone records in the middle of the night.
And when the investigators obtained the phone records for both Gabriela and Javier Barrios early that Monday morning, they discovered something interesting about the hours just before his death.
Barrios is on the phone with Gabby Escucha.
Considering what was in the order of protection Gabriela had taken out against Javier, the fact that she'd apparently been on the phone with him at all struck the investigators as odd.
He's perfectly willing and capable of hurting her.
Just what she and Javier had talked about, and whether it had anything to do with his death just a few hours later, the investigators couldn't say. But Gabriela could. And luckily for the investigators, the fact that Gabriela had been on the phone with Javier on Sunday wasn't all that her phone records revealed.
Gabriela had an alternate address listed on her cell phone bill.
At 5:30 on Monday morning, the Plainfield investigators showed up at the Chicago address listed on Gabriela's cell phone bill. And since the investigators weren't sure what they would find, they brought backup.
The Plainfield Police Department, the Chicago Police Department.
And as the officers approached the house, they noticed something interesting.
They see Gabriela's black Nissan sedan outside it.
It was a match for the car multiple witnesses had seen fleeing the scene of the shooting.
They saw the car pull up to a red light, stop, and then drive away.
Suspecting they had found Javier's killer, officers surrounded the house as a pair of Plainfield investigators approached the door.
They knock on the door and ask to speak with Gabriela.
The person who answered the door indicated that Gabriela was down the hall in a back bedroom.
They gave the police permission to come in the house.
And that's when the officers waiting outside stormed into the house.
There was just policemen everywhere.
They found Gabriela asleep in the back bedroom with a young man.
They opened their eyes to a police officer with a gun drawn.
Not that it was necessarily a new experience for the 18-year-old in Gabriela's bed. His name was Ricardo Gutierrez, and he'd recently gotten out of jail. Early on Monday morning, October 29, 2007, 18-year-old Gabriela Escucha sat in the back of a Plainfield, Illinois police car.
She was quite distraught. She had been through quite a bit.
Hours earlier, on Sunday afternoon, an unknown male assailant had gunned down Gabriela's ex-boyfriend, 18-year-old Javier Barrios at a busy suburban intersection.
By the time cops got to the scene and approached the victim, he was clearly already deceased.
It just so happened that Gabriela had recently taken out an order of protection against the dead man.
Police checked records and found that order of protection and went looking for her.
And when they finally caught up to Gabriela that Monday morning, she wasn't alone.
There's a guy asleep in the room with Gabriela.
His name was Ricardo Gutierrez, and he was Gabriela's boyfriend.
Her heart did belong to Ricardo.
Like Gabriela, Ricardo had been born in Chicago, but unlike her, his family had never left the city's south side.
Ricardo grew up in a tough, very, very tough neighborhood I'm personally familiar with. Just a tough kid.
And much like Javier, the 18-year-old already had a record.
He had a checkered past and, had been in trouble as a juvenile.
He was in a gang.
Not that given her questionable taste in men, Gabriela appeared to mind.
She felt very secure and loved in that relationship.
And while her family didn't approve,
Ricardo was not the guy for her.
That had done little to deter Gabriela.
Ricardo was the man that she was going to marry.
But then fate had intervened, courtesy of the Chicago police.
He ended up in that summer of 2007 being incarcerated.
Ricardo, I believe, had gotten out of juvenile prison, a month before the killings?
In other words, roughly the same time Gabriela had stopped seeing Javier.
As soon as Mr. Gutierrez was released from his incarceration, they reunited.
The police didn't think that it was a coincidence that the shooting occurred not long after Gabriela got back together with Ricardo.
He was a criminal and gangbanger.
And since he fit the description of the man witnesses had seen shooting Javier just 12 hours earlier, they placed him under arrest for murder.
He's removed in handcuffs and put in the back of the squad car.
Figuring she may have known something about Javier's murder, the police asked Gabriela to come in for questioning too.
She agreed to voluntarily go to the Plainfield Police Department.
However, even as the investigators drove Gabriela down to the station, she indicated that she was more than just a witness.
In the car, she made several incriminating statements.
She openly admitted she shot this young man.
Cops were actually surprised that Gabriela was so forthcoming with information.
But was she telling the truth, or simply trying to take the blame for Ricardo? After all, according to all the witnesses at the scene, Javier's killer had been a man.
This happened in the middle of the day at a busy intersection in broad daylight.
Whatever her reasons, Gabriela appeared anxious to confess once the investigators got her into the interrogation room.
She basically spelled it all out for him.
According to Gabriela, even though Ricardo had been jailed in the summer of 2007, the young couple had never really given up on each other.
She wanted to marry Ricardo. They had plans for a wedding.
However, with Ricardo put away, Gabriela had been lonely, which was where Javier came in.
Gabby saw Javier as a temporary summer boyfriend while Ricardo was in jail.
They became more as a casual dating, in her mind, just hanging out, having fun.
But Gabriela said that Javier hadn't seen things quite the same way.
I think if he could, he would have had her by his side 24 hours a day.
And according to Gabriela, he tried to get his way.
He had started to become very controlling as far as wanting to dictate her time, where she went, what she did, who she spoke to, even whether she went to school.
Gabriela said she had been disturbed by Javier's behavior, that she had tried to break things off.
She kept trying to spend time with other people and trying to break off contact with him.
But Gabriela told police that the more she had tried to avoid Javier, the more aggressive he had become.
He would threaten her.
He said, I could kill you and no one would ever find out.
Gabriela claimed that she believed him, too.
She was, slapped, kicked, and it ultimately escalated to an incident where he shot her with a BB gun.
Gabriela said that Javier also began hanging around the mall kiosk where she worked, basically stalking her.
She eventually ended up losing her job because he was coming around harassing her.
There was no getting away from it.
But in October 2007, Gabriela said that she had finally found a way out. Ricardo, her real boyfriend, had been released from jail.
Gabriela picked him up at the gate.
Gabriela said that once she reunited with Ricardo, she had explained the situation with Javier.
Gabriela may have been looking for not a shoulder to cry upon, but maybe a strong shoulder to lean upon.
However, she admitted that she had left out a few key details.
She did not tell Ricardo that she was dating Javier while he was locked up.
She had told Ricardo that Javier was a stalker, more or less, who was paying unwanted attention to her, and she had never reciprocated that interest.
And according to Gabriela, the news had the desired effect on Ricardo.
He was angry that Javier was supposedly threatening Gabby.
However, Gabriela also said that Ricardo, fresh out of jail himself, had hesitated when it came to confronting Javier. In fact, she claimed the order of protection had been his idea.
Ricardo was the one who said to Gabriela, hey, let the cops handle it. Let the courts handle it.
Although, according to Gabriela, the order of protection didn't faze Javier. Far from it, in fact.
He told her that the police weren't going to stop him, that an order of protection wasn't going to stop him.
Not only did Javier continue to threaten her, Gabriela claimed that he demanded to see her.
He's texting her, bitch, you better meet me.
And if she didn't, according to Gabriela, Javier's threats were terrifyingly specific.
Meet with me or I'm going to do terrible things to your child.
Gabriela told the police that after months of threats and abuse, she had no doubt that Javier was serious.
When he made threats to her in the past, those things always came true.
She became absolutely convinced that he would hurt her daughter.
And Gabriela said she had been determined to stop him.
The police aren't going to protect you, then you have to protect yourself.
She just said that she felt as a mother that she had to do something.
Not that she had intended to kill him, according to Gabriela.
Her intent was to confront Javier, say, look, enough is enough. I'm not putting up with this from you anymore. I don't want to be in a relationship with you. You need to go away and leave me alone.
So Gabriela said she had agreed to meet Javier at the abandoned gas station on the afternoon of October 28th.
He was under the impression she'd be coming alone.
But she hadn't been alone. Ricardo had come with her, although she claimed that hadn't been her idea.
Ricardo insisted, hey, let me take care of this.
And according to Gabriela, it was her gangbanger boyfriend who'd gotten her the gun.
Well, getting a gun for him is probably like getting a bag of chips for a normal person.
He and Gabriela decided that she should bring it along for her own protection.
So with the gun in her pocket and Ricardo hiding in the back seat, Gabriela said she had driven to the gas station and met with Javier.
She was going to take the weapon that she had obtained through Ricardo and threaten Javier and say, hey, you leave me alone.
And when Javier pulled into the gas station that afternoon, she said that she had gotten out of her car and approached his SUV, gun in hand.
She really felt that the gun would scare him off.
But according to Gabriela, as soon as she'd gotten close to Javier's vehicle, the entire plan had started to go wrong.
When Javier saw the gun, he said to her, "You bitch." Mr. Barrios obviously has no fear of her.
And Gabriela claimed that as soon as she realized that, she had made a split-second decision.
She was very, very frightened, and she pulls the trigger.
The bullet went into his chest.
Meanwhile, in the interrogation room down the hall, Ricardo was basically confirming Gabriela's story. He told the investigators that he'd been huddled in the backseat of Gabriela's car when she got out to talk to Javier.
If he did attempt to do anything physical or to harm her in any way, Ricardo was there to help and to protect her.
And according to Ricardo, he'd only come out of hiding after he heard the gunshot.
He sees the smoke. He sees the look on her face.
She turned and looked back at the car with a look of horror that he has never seen on her face before.
He'd also seen Javier exit his SUV and start to run.
He was grabbing towards his waistband.
And according to Ricardo, when he saw that, he assumed that Javier had a gun too.
Ricardo said that he believed that she was shot.
So, according to Ricardo, he'd run to Gabriela, who was struggling with her gun.
The semi-automatic handgun that she was using had jammed.
Ricardo, not knowing what had happened, grabs the firearm, clears the jam, and reloads the weapon.
And then Ricardo said he'd gone after Javier.
Meanwhile, Javier was running with the bullet already in his chest.
And as the investigators already knew, thanks to the numerous witnesses who'd seen what came next, by the time Ricardo caught up with Javier, he'd already collapsed, brought down by the shot Gabriela fired.
He lay on the ground face down.
But that hadn't stopped Ricardo.
He went over where Mr. Barrios lay, basically helpless, and shot him twice in the head.
Like Gabriela, Ricardo said that Javier's threats and abuse had left him no choice.
They were somehow claiming that was done in self-defense.
Not that the authorities saw it quite the same way.
One to the body and two to the back of the head. It's not self-defense. What she admitted to was first-degree murder.
And once the interrogations were over, the police charged both Gabriela and Ricardo with exactly that. First-degree murder.
Police had arrests made less than 24 hours after the killing.
On March 4th, 2014, 25-year-old Gabriela Escucha stood trial for murder at the Will County Courthouse in Joliet, Illinois. She and Ricardo Gutierrez had both been charged with killing Gabriela's ex-boyfriend, Javier Barrios.
This was a big case. It was a big press case.
Part of it was due to where Javier had been gunned down in broad daylight, a busy intersection in the upper-middle-class Chicago suburb of Plainfield.
Something like this is incredibly unusual there.
Then, there was the fact that it had taken prosecutors almost 7 years to bring the case to trial, thanks to a slew of pretrial motions by the defense.
We also filed various motions to suppress the statements that were taken at the station.
The defense alleged that the police had no probable cause to arrest them.
But in the end, all those motions failed, and now the young single mother was on trial for murder.
If you met her outside of this context, you would never in a million years say, oh, that girl shot somebody to death.
The same wasn't true of Ricardo, though.
Ricardo was a self-admitted gang member.
He'd also admitted to shooting Javier twice in the head at point-blank range.
Our defense at that time was that Ricardo was protecting Gabriella and defending himself.
But at his trial in March of 2013, the jury had decided otherwise.
Ricardo Gutierrez was convicted in the murder of Javier Barrios.
The 23-year-old was sentenced to 68 years in prison.
He, as it stands right now, will basically spend the rest of his life behind bars.
Of course, convicting a gang member who'd shot a defenseless man was one thing.
He basically killed them in cold blood.
But could they convict Gabriella? After all, if her confession was true, the circumstances in which she'd fired the first shot weren't quite as cold-blooded.
She said he was abusive to her physically, and she was worried for her own safety.
But in his open, the prosecutor said that Gabriella's claim that the shooting had been a split-second decision triggered by fear was a flat-out lie.
They lured him there to shoot him. That was the plan.
In fact, the prosecutors claimed that Gabriella had no reason to fear Javier, because according to the prosecutors, there'd been no threats and no abuse. And they put several members of Javier's family on the stand to back up those claims.
His family members, they never witnessed any form of abuse and had seen Gabriella around him very frequently.
And according to the prosecutors, it was no coincidence that the subject of Javier's abuse only came up once Ricardo was out of jail.
She did not want Ricardo to know that she was dating him.
She had told Ricardo that Javier was a stalker.
However, the prosecutors said there was one flaw in Gabriella's plan to hide the fact that she'd been dating while Ricardo was in jail. What if Javier and Ricardo talked and Ricardo learned the truth? According to the prosecutors, the answer had been obvious.
She needed him gone.
So the prosecution claimed that Gabriella had come up with a plan to get rid of Javier for good.
She also manipulated Ricardo into believing that they had to shoot Javier Barrios.
However, Gabriella admitted that she'd fired the first shot. And according to testimony from the medical examiner that conducted the autopsy, that made her Javier's killer.
The bullet that Gabi fired went to his heart.
The shot to his heart was going to kill him. He was going to die from that. And then the second shot from Gutierrez is what actually ended his life.
Finally, the prosecutors wrapped up their case by putting the investigator who'd interviewed Gabriella on the stand. In his testimony, he pointed out to the jury a tiny detail in her statement: what she'd been wearing on the afternoon of the shooting.
She had one glove.
Why just one?
So she would get fingerprints on that handgun.
And according to the prosecution, that proved Javier's murder had been premeditated.
I described Gabriella as a cold-blooded, manipulative killer.
When the defense presented their case, they didn't dispute that Gabriella had fired the first fatal shot.
Both the defense and the state more or less agreed on what actually happened.
But the defense insisted that Gabriella's abuse claims were painfully real.
A judge is not going to issue an order of protection willy-nilly. This is a case of self-defense.
And to prove their case, the defense put two domestic violence experts on the stand, both of whom testified that Gabriella had been traumatized after months of abuse at Javier's hands.
She was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder based on the domestic violence that she'd experienced.
And according to the experts, Gabriella had truly believed that meeting Javier had meant life or death, even if she hadn't really been in physical danger.
She was afraid at the time that she shot him. She wasn't angry.
The experts also claim that Gabriella's post-traumatic stress disorder was evident in her bizarre behavior immediately after the shooting.
She was somebody who was really sort of in a fog.
Which, according to the experts, explained the strangely unhurried manner in which she fled the scene.
After the incident, Gabby drove away rather calmly.
She stopped at a stoplight. You just murdered somebody. I mean, who cares about running a red light?
And then, on March 7th, the defense called the one witness best qualified to speak to Gabriella's state of mind on the afternoon of the shooting.
She had to testify in her own defense.
What we felt is that, really the jury has to get to know Gabby Escutia.
On the stand, Gabriella described the months of physical and psychological abuse that she'd allegedly suffered at Javier's hands.
Whenever she didn't go along, his response would be some sort of intimidation, some sort of threat, some sort of violence.
So Gabriella said she had agreed to meet Javier, hoping she could get him to back off.
Everybody said all along that the whole idea was to scare him.
But Gabriella told the court that when she realized that Javier wasn't scared, she'd done the only other thing she could think of to keep her and her daughter safe.
She came to the conclusion that he's not going to stop. There's nothing that is going to stop him unless I shoot him.
It seemed very calm and measured. It appeared to be sincere.
And Gabriella appeared just as sincere when she said that fateful decision had haunted her for the past 7 years.
She was incredibly remorseful and sad about how things had gone and wished that she had been able to figure out something different.
But Gabriella also told the court that after thinking it over for all those years, she knew that she was innocent of murder.
And she came to some sort of peace about what had happened.
She felt she might have been justified in her actions.
On March 12, 2014, the jury announced that it had reached a verdict in the trial of Gabriella Escutia. The 25-year-old single mother had admitted to gunning down 18-year-old Javier Barrios in 2007.
The state, in essence, has a full confession that she, in fact, did fatally shoot Javier Barrios.
Although the defense claimed that Gabriella's actions had been justified. According to her testimony, their short 4-month relationship had been marred by abuse.
The whole defense is battered women syndrome.
The prosecution had dismissed those claims, though. Instead, they argued that Javier's murder had been premeditated.
They tried to portray it as she's just this calloused, killer.
Is unarmed, bring a gun and wear a glove to keep from getting fingerprints on that gun. It's kind of hard to prove a self-defense case with those circumstances.
Not that the prosecutors were feeling all that confident when the jury filed back into the courtroom after only 4 hours of deliberation.
I am always nervous when a jury is out, so it's hard to be optimistic at that point.
Across the aisle, Gabriella's defense team was guardedly optimistic.
To me, there's a world of difference between somebody who picks up a weapon because they want to keep themselves safe and a person who picks up a weapon because they want that person dead. I thought the jury might see it as more a manslaughter.
I was just hoping for the best, but I'm pretty sure in the back of the mind, all of us, we were preparing for the worst.
But would they need to be? No one knew exactly what to expect when the verdict was read.
Gabby was convicted of first-degree murder.
Gabriella's reaction was subdued.
She didn't cry or gasp out. She sat there very stoically.
But her friends and family were outraged.
I really thought that the juror would take into consideration everything that this man had put her through.
And when the judge handed down her sentence on July 1st, she had little sympathy for Gabriella. The sentence was 52 years in prison.
She has to serve every day.
I don't see her walking out of prison.
Perhaps, although Gabriella appears determined to beat the odds.
She was, okay, where do we go from here? And what's the next step?
She sees, I guess, the silver lining and everything. Her spirit isn't down.
Because she has her daughter who's still waiting for her. Still has a whole life ahead of her, who needs her mom next to her.
That was amazing. I love this.